So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another HEE Bridging Scheme debate. My name is Neil Hudson-Basing. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the Corporate Events Manager from London South Bank University. This is centralised government funding support for NHS clinical academics. And I'm going to start the event, before I take you through some virtual housekeeping, with an opening poll. And so the question is, this House believes that centralised government funding should support, through salary provision, the careers of all clinical academics within the NHS. So that poll has started. So I'm going to give you a few moments to answer that while I take you through some virtual housekeeping, starting with a short statement on respect and dignity. So everyone attending or speaking at an LSBU event, whether in person or virtually, should be treated with respect, dignity and courtesy. We value contributions, feedback and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating and bringing communities together. LSBU does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour will be treated seriously and acted upon, and anyone exhibiting any such behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. I'm sure that's not going to be a problem today, and Yat's going to follow up with some information on that. We want our events to be an enjoyable, safe and warm experience for all. So thank you for adhering to these guidelines, and past debates have been brilliant. So you're in good hands this afternoon. So just to take you through the Zoom functionality, we are in Zoom webinar, which means we cannot see or hear you, but you can communicate in a couple of ways. Firstly, through the polls, and I can see that people are busy answering there in the background now. The chat box is a great way to introduce yourselves, let us know who you are, what you do, and where you're joining us from in the absence of seeing you face to face. It's wonderful to know who our audience are, and please feel free to share your thoughts and comments in there throughout. Far from detracting from the event, it helps to bring the event to life and opens up that discussion. There's also the Q&A box, and if you have any specific questions for our panel, I'd like you to pop your questions in the Q&A box so we don't lose them in the chat box. Let us know who your question's for. You can also upvote on the questions you most want answered by clicking the thumbs up symbol, and that boosts them to the top. And it puts the power back in your hands so you can see the questions that you most want to address. And we've factored in lots of time for questions later. You'll see that I've enabled closed captioning, which are the subtitles. You can hide them if you wish to do so by clicking the little up arrow next to CC live transcript, but we do enable those in the interest of inclusivity and accessibility. There are a number of ways you can help us to help us reach a wider audience beyond the event itself. Firstly, the event is being recorded, and you're welcome to share that with anyone that you feel might be interested. But you can also share your thoughts and comments on Twitter. We love to see them, and it helps to bring the conversation to a wider audience. And I'm going to pop our hashtag and Twitter handle in the chat box just there. That's all from me. If you have any questions at all, I'm in the background. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Benjamin Thomas from LSBU. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Neil, very much. And welcome everybody to, as Neil says, to LSBU and to our first Health Education England NIHR integrated clinical academic post-doctoral bridging scheme 2022 debate. These debates explore contemporary issues in clinical academia. And today's debate, which I'm hoping is going to be incredibly lively, will concerns the funding of clinical academics. So I'm sure we can all have something to say about that. Anyway, I just want to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Yat Zhang, who's going to be chairing the debate panel today. And yeah, let's get started. Over to you, Yat.
Thanks, Ben, and welcome everyone. I think I just want to say that it's my great pleasure to be able to chair our first LSBU ICA postdoc bridging scheme debate. And I just want to say that, you know, with I think as the effort that everyone can see that we've got a great kind of panelist, and then so that I just want to introduce them very quickly. So for today's debate, you know, our topic is about centralized government funding should support through the salary provisions and the careers of all academics within the NHS. So for the motions, we have Ian Simcock. So Dr. Ian Simcock is a diagnostic radiographer from Great Ormond Street Hospitals, and also that we got Matthew Adler. So, and Matt is Deputy Ward Managers at the Guy's and Thomas hospitals. And for against the motions, we got Danny Hatfield, and as Dan is a critical care nurse and research fellow at King's College Hospitals. And we got Dr. Sarah Collins as well. She's a specialist dietitian at Royal, Brompton and Hatfield Hospitals. So, so the debate, I would say that, for the motions and for against the motions, each panelist will have 5 minutes to put their statements across. And after that, we'll go in the Q&A sessions, as Neil mentions, and then hopefully by that time that we'll have a closing poll to see how the audience feel about that. And before I pass on to the panelists to do the debate, I just want to re-emphasize the points that Neil saying that, and for all the conversations that we have today, that, I just want 2 principles: be kind and be respectful. And the other thing that is, for the debate, and the panelists, they work really hard, try to make the debate lively and controversial, so we're able to facilitate the discussions. But the points that the panelists make today doesn't really reflect their own personal views on the topic, and non saying that, it's representing the organizing, the employer, they employ them as well. So I want to make it very clear. And all the points and all the statements the panelists made today is purely for facilitating conversation on this contemporary, contemporary issues that we have within the community. So, so be kind and be respectful. I think, as Neil said, that we are really welcome for the Twitter and also social media attentions for the debate, but we don't want that to come into anything that is causing any uncomfortable feeling for our panelists. I just want to ensure that we protect our ICA postdoc research schemes panelists very well as well. So I don't want to hold on for too long for the introductions. So I just want to pass on to Ian and to start the debate and about 4 the motions. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that introduction. Yes, that's really helpful. So dear attendees, today, I've been chosen to argue for the motion before you that centralised government funding should support, through salary provision, the careers of all clinical academics within the NHS. Next slide, please. We all know that money and funding is tighter than ever, yet healthcare provision has so recently demonstrated its ability to confront worldwide problems. Healthcare researchers work collectively at astounding speeds to develop innovative solutions in the COVID pandemic. And healthcare research has demonstrated that improvements are possible in the world's health through targeted funding. Yet lack of funding is often the main reason that stops research in its tracks. And through my 25 years in healthcare, I've continually observed this squeeze on budgets, and at the same time observed areas where improvements could have been made had funding been made available. Accurately identifying clinical healthcare needs is essential to ensure that we maximise the clinical impact of research. And to this end, the benefits of clinical academics have been recently highlighted with an increase in the availability of funding, often for 100% of their salaries, for their development through schemes run by the NIHR and, of course, others. Yet financial issues are repeatedly seen once the funding through these schemes falls below 100%. And at this point in their careers, individuals are expected to gain funding from their host organisations. Next slide, please. Yet at this vital point in their careers, just as research independence is gained, hospital departments often feel unable to accept the risk of their employment through a substantive contract. And this is due to departments often requiring more immediate payback, whereas in reality, grant awards can often take over a year to be developed and awarded, time departments simply cannot afford when investing in these posts. And this short-sighted approach can then restrict the development of research, requiring a grant application often be run up during the professional's own time, or even squeezed between clinical practice. Surely there is a better way to develop complex research studies, which in the end will benefit all of our health and well-being. Next slide, please. Today, I have been chosen to argue that there may be a better way by making funding for salaries available from a central government fund. Suitably trained clinical academics could then apply for a substantive contract through this scheme, demonstrating their skills and clinically impactful work already undertaken. And this would allow successful candidates job security to continue their postdoctoral work whilst remaining aligned to a suitable clinical environment, thus removing the financial pressure on local budgets and allowing the clinical academic to continue in their research role. Salary funding from this central pot could then be either reduced following a successful grant application or increased whilst further grant funding was being developed, and a continual cycle of grant development and research completion could begin, providing job security alongside impactful research. Next slide, please. This would allow for the often tortuous road to securing funding to be streamlined, with a longer-term view being taken, whilst the risk-benefit is placed firmly on the Government Health Research Department rather than burdening the individual healthcare institution. Equally, by attracting clinical academics to work in their institution, departments could see it as a badge of excellence, demonstrating a forward-thinking department with research at its core. This would also reap further benefits, with academic skills being fostered amongst other staff and exposing them to novel, innovative ideas, with benefits for staff retention and career progression, and would result in the clinical academics' highly developed skills in developing, conducting and disseminating research being able to be used and passed on to other professionals within this healthcare setting. Would this reduce competition? Well, individuals will still have to apply to the central pot of funding, ensuring that research project standards are maintained. Funders such as the NHS and Wellcome already have demonstrated their ability to identify talent and clinically impactful research. So surely this approach could be adopted through assessing the person, place and project so currently valued by funding institutions. Obviously, impactful research is currently being completed. I'm simply offering an alternative, possibly better solution to the current model that will provide clinical academics with more security to develop their research. My esteemed colleagues today arguing against this motion may say that this places another layer of government interaction into research. I'm not saying this solution is perfect, and work would be required to ensure sufficient funding is consistently made available. But there has to be a better solution to the current system, where funding for substantive contracts is simply rarely available. Overall, I've been chosen today to propose that by centralising this funding, it will remove the emphasis of funding from individual departments that's simply placing undue pressure on individuals' own time to a central pot of money. This will ease the pressure on clinical academics, enabling clinically impactful research to benefit patients and their families. Please vote for the motion today. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce the first speaker talking against the motion, Dr. Daniel Hadfield. Thank you.
You're just on mute there, Daniel.
Apologies, my button is not working. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian, for that very polished performance. I mean, who wouldn't want guaranteed funding for clinical academics? It sounds idyllic, and I can guarantee, you know, many of you would like that, but I can also guarantee it's completely unrealistic, and that's what I'm going to argue now. So my name is Daniel Hadfield. I would describe myself as a clinical academic. I'm a critical care nurse, a research fellow at King's College Hospital. Next slide, please. So firstly, I want to talk you through who I am, why I've got some authority in this area, and some of my limitations. I think that's quite important. First thing to say is I'm no expert in research funding. That's quite a complex issue, but you know, apart from what I've learned for this particular debate, and no expert in HR issues. But I have recently completed an NHS doctoral research fellowship in 2018, and I've had many difficulties in defining and funding a new research role. I've also been part, until very recently, of the 70 at 70 scheme, which is a national group of research leaders in nursing and midwifery. And we've spent a lot of our time discussing clinical academic careers, and many people have difficulties in this area. So I've also got a lot of experience of mentoring and supervising people at the beginning of clinical academic careers on PCAFs, etc. So I think that that does give me some authority to talk on this. And as I've said, in particular, in my circumstance, I've needed funding. I've completed numerous funding applications following the end of my PhD, and I'm looking for that next phase of my clinical academic role. If we can move to the next slide, please. So you'd think that I was in support. I would naturally be in support of this motion. You know, of course I would want guaranteed funding. But the more I've looked into this, the more I think that this proposal is a little bit, it's all about me. It's all about me, 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 and you want your cake and you want to eat it. You've just come off the end of a very generous PhD fellowship. It's provided you funding for your training, for going to conferences, to have all of that time to yourself, to do your own work, focused on you, and now you want salary as well. It doesn't really work like that. I'm being deliberately provocative. I think that was part of the role here. But in all seriousness, we do have currently a very generous and effective system. And there are many opportunities within that. So why would or should the NHS grant automatic salary funding just because you have got a PhD and you've been through your training? Research is about proving yourself, it's about defending your work, and it's about demonstrating your worth and the research value. And if that's lost, you'll also be losing some of the quality and the impact of what we're producing. Next slide, please. So the proposal left me with many questions, and the next two slides are quite a long list of these questions, but the first three are perhaps the most important ones here. So who is eligible? What is a clinical academic, and what is clinical academic work? What work would be funded? And really importantly, where on earth is this funding going to come from? And how is it going to be administered? That's a lot of extra funding. I mean, the actual statement said you're going to fund all clinical academics in the NHS. That demands an awful lot of new infrastructure. In the infrastructure, the NIHR you saw in the previous slide funds not just people, it funds projects, it funds various things, infrastructure across the UK. So I'm not quite sure where the funding will be provided for. And also, we haven't discussed the universities in this. So if the funding all comes from the NHS will be funding clinical academics. And that's great, but the universities are intrinsically linked to academic work. They're very important to universities, so they could either benefit or lose out depending on how you look at it. And you could be potentially funding staff that would then move on to university roles. And again, it's sort of repeating, but if there's no agreed and peer-reviewed program that we're discussing, I think Ian did say that there will be some sort of competitive element to this. But if there isn't, then where's the governance, the oversight of guarantee of quality and of the research that you're producing? If it is like Ian said, and it is a competitive process, then how is that different to the current situation where there is already a competitive process and you can move to the next stage of the NIHR training scheme? Next slide, please. I'm basing this on it being guaranteed funding for all clinical academics, as in the statement. So if that was the case, then that could create divisions and elitism if people were guaranteed funding and support, just like for the fact of having a PhD and some research training. And also, I think one of the points of the defending team is that it might improve the distribution of research funding outside of expert centres, but I would argue that that wouldn't happen. Funding will inevitably funnel towards the larger expert centres. But maybe that's the right thing because they make the best use of that particular funding, having the expertise in those centres. It doesn't get watered down the effect. And if you're going to centralise something, then you are probably going to have some sort of standardized definition for what a clinical academic role is. But our NHS institutions that are affected by this are very, very different, heterogeneous group of institutions with different needs, etc., and workforce. So they need the flexibility to determine how their funding is used and how clinical academics are used. Next slide, please. So in summary, I think this is, in principle, a great idea, but it just does not add up. There's no definition for clinical academics. There's diverse needs across various services across the NHS. You can't mandate this kind of scheme. And there's an impossible extra funding demand from this and increased bureaucracy. So overall, this proposal, I would say, has limited potential to add value on top of the current system that we have. So please vote no against this motion. Thank you. Oh, handing over now to Dr. Matthew Alders from Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital.
Thanks, Dan, for those very persuasive points. I'm now going to be providing the next few arguments for the motion that centralised government funding should support, through salary provision, the careers of all clinical academics within the NHS. I am a nurse by background. I recently completed my PhD a few years ago, and since then I've gone back into a full-time clinical role. And before me lies the challenge of navigating the complicated landscape of clinical academic career in nursing. Next slide, please. I believe that centralised funding will streamline a lot of this daunting process. So currently, funding sources are sit in a wide range of ad hoc areas. This is including local, national, international, charity, and even industry sources. And it takes a lot of time, energy, and a significant amount of stress to identify those sources of funding, apply for them, and go through these various application processes. And there's a lot of energy spent having to continually think about, where are my next sources of funding coming from? And often there is an overlap between your current funding source and spending time applying for your next funding source before that has finished. If we can remove that stress, time, and energy by having one central location to apply for funding, that means all of that time could be spent delivering, disseminating, and implementing research into practice and making that clinical academic role much more effective in what they're doing. Next slide, please. Building on the points that Ian mentioned in our first set of arguments, I also think that centralised funding would provide equal opportunities for clinical academics across the UK. We've already mentioned that it's difficult to demonstrate impact, particularly early on in your career as a researcher. We're often trying to explore complex clinical problems, and complex problems require detailed answers. Those aren't something that you can come up with straight away. In the current world in which we live in, finance is an increasingly difficult problem to respond to, and lots of hospital trusts cannot justify salaries for people early on in their career as a researcher when they can't demonstrate immediate impact and immediate benefit for what they're doing. By centralising the funding, this removes the financial burden from local hospital trusts, and it means that people that work in any hospital trust have an equal ability to apply for and access funding for research. And I think this is also going to begin a positive cycle of recruitment and retention for highly skilled individuals to remain at these local trusts that may well have left to seek opportunities elsewhere. And next slide, please. And building on my previous 2 points, this is kind of more of an aspirational point, but I think that the greater job security, the streamlined funding application processes, and equal opportunities across the UK are going to result in a significant positive cascade of development, where you have more clinical academics across the UK spending more time doing more research embedded at more hospital trusts. And I think this is going to mean that people that didn't consider these careers before are now going to see it as an option. I think it's going to mean that we're going to have one central place where the research is funded from, which means there is one central place that knows about where all the research is happening, we can develop more effective databases, link up people across the UK for more effective local and international collaboration. And as Dan mentioned earlier, we already have some centralised funding through the NIHR, for example. There is already a focus in the NIHR for person, place and project. And I think wider centralised funding, more accessible to everyone, will mean that those things are all going to improve over time. So those are my points. I am now going to hand over to Dr. Sarah Collins to provide the final opening argument against the motion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like our previous speaker, I was also fortunate to complete a PhD through NIHR funding. And subsequently, like him, I've also had to go back to a full-time clinical role, and I'm trying to currently navigate the complex field of applying for further research funding. This afternoon, I'm going to continue from Daniel's presentation for this debate against the motion that centralised government funding should support, through salary provision, the careers of all academics, clinical academics in the NHS. Next slide, please. First of all, we need to think about that clinical academics are healthcare professionals who combine clinical research responsibilities within their roles. But like Daniel has already alluded to, there is no agreed definition for this term, and it can mean different things to different people, different NHS establishments, and in the academic world. So two definitions of a clinical academic may not actually be the same. The current funding streams that support healthcare professionals and nurses in their chosen clinical academic professions are hugely competitive and attract a high calibre of applicants. With the centralised funding of government funding for research, would this still be the case? Will we still attract these high calibre professionals? We need to ensure that the quality of the professionals and the research is maintained throughout a fair and rigorous application process that we currently have now. And if we change this, how will we go about doing this? Why are we going to change such a rigorous process that is in place and is currently working? Next slide, please. Currently, there's a wide diversity in funding streams that are available to attract a huge range of individuals from many professional backgrounds and a wide breadth of sort of skills, experiences, and in many difficult clinical and research areas. So you're attracting people perhaps who've been in clinical backgrounds for many, many years to some that are just on their clinical journey. These professionals are not just from acute NHS trusts, but also from community and mental health settings. How will the centralised funding work for them? What links these people in their clinical academic careers? Are their interests to develop research while maintaining their clinical competencies? These individuals come from all stages of their careers. Will this still be the case if we continue with centralised funding? Will we be able to attract people and support people from NHS, from mental health and community trusts? Or is there going to be an established criteria and banding for people who support? What are the rules? What are they going to be? And how are we going to ensure that there's equal access to professionals in non-acute trusts, and how we maintain this? With centralised funding, will there be specific funding calls linked to specialities of the trust and academic partners? Or is it the case that diversity would be limited and that trusts will just attract people within their trust to complete these rewards? So how are we going to really maintain this diversity that we are currently seeing, and this expertise and quality of different people? Next slide, please. We mustn't forget about charity and other organisations that support research for researchers at very different levels of their careers. Many charities such as Cancer Research UK, the Wellcome Trust have affiliated programmes that fund training pathway schemes and research projects. Would centralised funding still support these? Would they still be able to attract high calibre researchers to complete their research? And how about charities, that are smaller charities, perhaps such as those as rare disease, which, attract people who are particularly interested in those diseases? Will these still exist with centralised fundings? and how they attract these applicants. You know, are we going to be able to maintain the recognition of the work that these charities are supporting, which is hugely valuable to research within people with these disease? And how are they going to incorporate this role into centralised funding? And how are they still going to attract a range of applicants and keep the interest going in these charity grants, which, like I say, are important? Next slide, please. If we think about uncertainty regarding career progression, you know, our colleagues have argued that actually the centralised funding would make things streamline. I think this is certainly not the case. You know, clinical academic careers for nurses and allied professions do not follow a set pathway like they do for our medical colleagues. You know, I would argue that centralised funding and salary provision is not really going to help this. It's actually our pathway that we need to change. What happens to the end of one award? You know, do people need to start applying for a new fellowship before the next one finishes? You know, how easy is it to do that when you're trying to complete research projects, publish and provide clinical service, you know, that most people have to go back to? And will your hospital trust actually offer you a job when one of your awards finishes? Or what are you hung high and dry about a job? Will you be able to maintain your career progression, or will you go back to the grading that you were before the award was awarded? You know, has anyone tried to get a mortgage on a fixed term contract when you've got instability in your career? And it's very challenging and stressful for people. There's no guidelines about banding or career progression in clinical academia due to the lack of our pathway. This affects morale and motivation, and certainly I think about my own career, and you know, I've lost track of the numerous hours of my own time that I've used to write grant applications and fellowship proposals to help develop my clinical academic career while trying to hold down a full-time clinical job. You know, some clinical academics will sort of move between funders at various points. So maybe they will start their career for charity and then move to more centralised or a government type funding or a scheme such as the NIHR. Are these opportunities still going to arise? And, you know, they're able to engage with activities such as perhaps teaching during their sort of funding as well. The clinical academic career pathway is often described as leaky, you know, whereby researchers are lost from the profession as they're unable to progress along a trajectory. So will centralised funding actually be able to maintain these professions? No, probably not. Studies have shown that some of the reasons that people leave and drop out of research and is really due to the work-life balance, all the challenges securing funding, uncertainties about career progressions, problems with mentorship, and difficulties obtaining career guidance. Centralised government funding will not help with this unless it's accompanied by a seamless clinical academic pathway that provides certainty about career progression, as this is what we're lacking. Next slide, please. If we go on to think about the relationship between academic partners and trusts, it's already been alluded to that actually how the university is going to benefit from this. You know, will the relationships with the academic partners and NH trusts be improved with centralised funding? It's highly unlikely. Firstly, will there be a dictation of who your academic partners will be? So will certain trusts only be able to have a partnership with certain universities, for example? This would leave researchers with less flexibility in choosing their academic partners best suited to their individual needs of the trust. You know, so are we going to be dictating what they can and can't do? Secondly, will people choose the projects and research that they want to do? Or is that going to be dictated by the trust and academic partner, therefore reducing ownership and a sense of choice? Thirdly, would there be less thoughts given to the clinical academic, but more consideration to what works best for the universities and trusts and their local, you know, the local partnership? Actually, are we just going to decide, actually, this is the research we want to do, we'll find someone to do it? And finally, will this encourage the work in silos? You know, will the researchers be part of a team in a local defined area with local goals and aims? This will create a sense of, you know, isolation, what's going on in the wider research field. You know, what if your expert is there's not an expert in your disease or your research field in this academic partnership there? You know, how will you get that support? Or actually, are you going to have to leave your academic partnership and go to one where they will provide you with the support that you need? So I think we can see that, just to conclude, that centralised funding doesn't really provide a guarantee of funding. It doesn't make things simple or streamless, and it doesn't answer the questions about uncertainty that people have in progressing with their clinical academic careers. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's great. I think thanks Ian, thanks Dan, thanks Matt, thanks Sarah for your cover, leading a statement and the background informations for the audience to rethink on these kind of important issues. And I just want to say that, we've got like loads of Q&A coming in, and I just looking through the questions. I think all four of you did a great job of kind of giving this full of thought for the audience to think about. And to start with the kind of the Q&A sections, I just want you kind of following Sarah's kind of presentations. And I think we've got two questions actually kind of on the same thing about, so this question is for Ian and Matt. Audience are asking that we're moving to a scheme of centralized funding scheme will remove the ability and flexibility for the service providers to use the local trust funding, and also about the charity funding and to support the kind of the innovations of the clinical academic activities. So Ian and Matt, how do you feel about that point?
I think I'm happy to answer that. I think that what I'm not saying is that all research funding would go through one big department. Of course, all clinical academics, as they started their careers, dipped their toes in, started out small, did small abstracts, small audits, developed their research ideas. So I'm not saying that none of this would happen unless you had a great big vote. It's more for those people who have developed their PhDs and are on that clinical academic pathway, but moving into independent researchers who therefore might need that salaried protection. So I think that the local trust would hopefully still have funding, and I don't have a magic money tree. There's no magic pot there that I've got squirreled away in my cupboard, or if I wish I had. But I think that I still would want people to be encouraged by their local trusts and their local leaders and local managers to do that. And as salaried clinical academics, hopefully we would be helping in that, and they would know where we are, and we could start to nurture those points. So I'm not saying that little innovation and that start out would be cut off.
Thank you. And I may just kind of push it a little bit more that, that Matt may be able to comment on it. When a centralized government funding, how can we ensure the local charity get the focus they would like to get when they're losing that kind of, because you have a centralized government funding that, so the funding source will be different. So how can our local charity to get the focus they would like to get through the kind of the funding they provide to our staff?
I think that you could have specific funding calls for themed research associated with whatever the charity is focused on. So the charity can still raise money for research. They can feed that into a centralized pot of funding, but it could be protected for specific research calls. For example, British Heart Foundation could raise money, and then they could request that money that goes into the central fund is only used for funding for research in heart failure or hypertension or anything like that.
A little bit like the partnerships that already exist in the fellowships that are given at the moment via the NHR and some charities that have partnerships agreed already. So it is there already, but I take someone's point that they made on the chat that this has been a little bit NIHR focused. There are we need to broaden that out a bit to think about the people who have gone through this on a different route, to talk about the charities in particular.
That's great, thank you. And I think just give Ian and Matt a break. I think a question directly to Dan and Sarah, I think is just about, they say about NIHR always fund you at your current band unless there's an appropriate role to apply in your local trust for a higher band. So you can go through to a master or PhD as a clinicians with no pay progressions. So without the kind of NIHR scheme like this, how do you think that we're able to support our colleagues to pursue a master or PhD as a clinicians without any pay protections?
I think most awards at the moment, whatever they are, you go in to the award on your banding that you are on, and then when the award's finished, you stay on that banding. I think some hospital trusts acknowledge that you've acquired skills, you will bring in money towards that trust, perhaps through future grant applications and things, and may then provide you with a higher banded job at the end of it. But most trusts won't. I mean, from my own personal experience, I didn't gain anything from doing a PhD. You know, I did a PhD and 3 years later I went back on the same banding that I was on with no pay progressions because I was already at the top of that band.
Could I just ask what the question was again? Yeah, was it something about supporting people doing postgraduate MSc type stuff? Could you
Yeah,
say,
I think it's
could you
just
say it
about.
again?
So I think they say that for like a centralized government funding like NHR, they will always fund people at the current band and to do a master and PhD. So I think just so without a scheme like this, you know, how can we kind of support our colleagues to do any postgrad kind of educations?
I think the problem is that the clinical academic pathway is not defined to match those roles, is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
There isn't a clinical academic pathway, and we know that in an ideal world there would be some sort of clinical academic pathway that involved collaboration between the universities and the trusts who are both gaining benefit out of those clinical academic roles in different ways. That's the collaboration that needs to happen at different levels. So I don't think it will be fixed by a central pot making it easier for people to come to be completing these grant applications, etc.
I think that leads into my next question. Sorry, Ian, go on.
I was just going to come back, but maybe by centralizing it and by recognizing those clinical academic careers, maybe that central fund then could say, okay, so you've finished your PhD, this is your banding now, or you've now moved on to this senior researching role or professorship, and that kind of thing. And there are guidance out there that I helped to co-write the Society of Radiographers clinical academic career guidance. So there is guidance out there, and that does have set banding for different parts of that journey through that clinical academic. So there are individual societies helping to do that, and I'm sure there are other professions out there that have started to make those roles more concrete to give guidance to those managers and the departments who are hopefully going to employ them. So
yeah, I think that's great. I think that leading into my questions that I think all four of you are great, in your presentations, but I think in the audience that I think they're saying something that I've been thinking about as well. They say, what are your thoughts about what are the definitions for clinical academic is? Because I think Sam mentioned about, for definitions of the clinical academic does not just include the requirement of meaningful, clinically based, patient-facing activities. And so, what are the definitions for clinical academics? What group of staff we're talking about? So I think it'd be great to have all four of you to comment on that.
I think it's helpful to keep the definition as broad as possible to make it as inclusive as possible. So I think that we could say that a clinical academic is anyone that works in a clinical role that has interest or pursuing activity in research at whatever level that might be.
Thank you, Matt, because that makes your proposal even more unworkable. Because if you include everybody, then my initial point, how on earth could you then filter through this funding to all clinical academics? I do, agree that if you have a salary through the NHS and you are participating or contributing to research, then there is, you could apply the term clinical academic to your role. I do agree in that sense, but in terms of the proposal, that's a very, very, very broad group of individuals.
I don't agree. Sorry, Ian.
No, that's right. I was just coming to your aid there, Matt. You're all right. But I think that what Matt was saying there wasn't that it should open the floodgates to anyone who can call themselves a clinical academic. I think there would be a level at which it would go in at. And I agree that it's anyone who's working at a highly specialised clinical level, as well as combining that with clinically impactful research that they're using through their academic skills. So I think that it is a very loose term and hasn't been narrowed down. But I think this pot would only be available to people who have already, completed a certain level and demonstrated that impactful research and that development of their career, I think.
Just because it's a central pot doesn't mean there can't be different levels of funding or projects that you can apply for. So you could apply for something at audit level on a ward, or you could apply at a level that is postdoc research across multiple sites.
That's
but
brilliant.
is audit level on a ward a clinical academic? No, someone starting out in their research.
I think it can be. I think you can be earlier in your clinical academic journey, or you can be later in your clinical academic journey. But I think you have to start somewhere, and I think you can approach that as a aspiring clinical academic, I suppose.
But this research activity that we're talking about is supposed to be an integral part of our roles and is written into our codes of conduct for our different professions. How do you separate out those activities and fund them separately? I don't see a workable solution to that, because it's written into our job descriptions already. It's written into many people's. I'm not discussing whether it's actually occurring or not, but it is there. It's part of people's responsibility, and they are currently funded to do it. So I don't understand the change that this would represent.
So I think the change would be is that actually the roles that this would be funding are those people who are applying for research funding, whether that's from a charity, whether that's from the NIHR, whether that's from any institution that's going to fund that research. This will just fund that salary for those experienced researchers who need that level of support so that they can develop these highly competitive grant applications. It's not for everybody who's going to complete an audit on the department. Those are really important to be done, but that's not who this salary progression is for, the salary support is for. It's for those people who are beginning to build their independence or are going, moving into independence postdoctoral, who can then have that salary backup. So it still needs the buy-in from the teams and the buy-in from the professions to make sure that we're all completing audits or developing research or staying on top of innovation to help to make sure that the patient and the family have that benefit. It's just the support we're talking about is just for those higher up the chain of development and career progression.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think we just saw from the audience, I think Fiona mentioned about, loving your discussions about defining, the definitions of clinical academics. So I think Fiona already tasked 4 of you to write a paper on the consensus definitions. So, and thanks, Fiona. I think those panelists, they will take that on board. And then we're expecting an outcome paper from this very soon. And just following the conversations, I've mostly with Sarah and Dan as well. I think Ian kind of touched on that point. But Sarah, you mentioned about you complete your fellowship with no change in the grade and pay band at the end because there's no actual post for you to apply for. So for Dan and Sarah, do you think a central pot of funding will encourage the trust to raise the pay band following the clinical academic time, and allowing the clinical academic time to find a future funding while working in a more senior role within the trust?
I think it's difficult. I think when you decide to do a PhD or further research, then you're making that choice to progress, and it's not necessarily identified for that role. So I think trusts would have to identify roles that they need that have that level of qualification or academic and research experience required for them. And I think that's where the pathway is also lacking. It's not saying, okay, if you're an a BHC, you need to have X, Y, and Z qualifications. That's not there at the moment.
I think we need to be clear that what would happen if these posts and funding for these posts appeared is that the institutions with the expertise and experience of gaming the system in research would rise to the top and get the funding above other institutions. That's just the natural way of that if it's a competitive pot. I'm not sure it would increase the local buy-in and the integration of people into the local priorities of each, particular hospital, it doesn't solve that issue, to my mind, of local clinicians and line management, etc., suddenly changing their priorities towards research, which is what we need to happen eventually. Because at the moment, if there's limited funding, and they see that the priority is dealing with clinical issues, and that's understandable. So I think that something needs to be done to increase integration between the two. But providing centralized funding that is applied for competitively doesn't fix that.
Thank you.
No, I agree. I agree. It doesn't fix that at all. And this is not a fix-all type thing. It's just to try and offer some support in their later careers. But it won't mean that a small DGH can equally compete with a massive institution that has academic connections and built up. I think that's something that's always been there and still exists this day. So it's still difficult to beat, for sure, and needs tackling.
Yeah. And I think I will mention the last questions because I feel like, and it's very relevant, especially with the announcement with Boris Johnson's. I think Sarah mentioned about for Ian and Matt, how vulnerable will centrally funded clinical academic posts to be when there's a flip-flop changes in the political priorities and directions? Do you think that will provide security and continuity of this funding for the clinical academic careers when we see that the funding drives around the election periods may change?
I think it will provide greater security than there currently is for clinical academic careers. I think there are already good examples of centralized funding. I think we've already talked about the NIHR a lot, but that is an example of centralized funding that seems to have been relatively stable since its inception, continues to offer a limited amount of funding for specific pathways and development. And I think a larger centralized pot that's more accessible would mean more stability.
Sarah, do you mind if I take the against? Or
Go on, Dan.
I don't want to dominate.
Please do, Dan.
By its very nature, if the funding is central, then it's more susceptible to political change. That's just a fact. So if there is political change and the priorities of the NHS or the NIHR or the Department of Health change, then that centralized funding and that system you put in place will have to change. Whereas there's less potential change at a local level if you have, and I admit that this is a difficult ask, developed some sort of collaboration between the university and the hospital that is based on local priority and need. So I think that the centralized funding doesn't guarantee more stability.
But local healthcare institutions are also publicly funded, as are the education institutions. So would they not be as susceptible to changes in the political landscape?
I think that they are to an extent, but if you need to embed something, it has to be local, and it will be embedded based on the need of the local population or the local institution or their priorities. And I think that there's something about adaptability as well. They need to be able to adapt and change. So
yeah, I think thanks Dan and thanks Matt. I think I may need to cut you guys a bit short because for the time that we've got, and before I pass on to Neil to do the closing poll, that I just want to re-emphasize, all the points and statements the panelists made is purely for the debate. And so Ian and Matt doesn't mean that, they say that all the posts should be funded by, central report. And Sarah and Dan doesn't mean that they don't want or they don't welcome any centrally funding for any clinical academic posts or activities. So I want to re-emphasize it. All the statements and points that they made today is purely for kind of the facilitating the conversations and discussions around this topic. So I'll back to Neil now about the closing poll.
Perfect. So closing poll, same question. This House believes that centralised government funding should support through salary provisions the careers of all clinical academics within the NHS. Are you for? Are you against? I'll give you a moment just to go through that question and pop your answers across. They're coming through very fast. Keep them coming.
And I think Neil, that before that was a majority of the audience feel like it's for the motions, right?
Yeah, sure. But we'll hand over to our panel for their closings. Yeah, Ian, do you want to start?
Sorry, yeah, I was just finding my mute button. You're all right. Sorry, guys. So you've heard the argument from my colleagues today that it will all be about me and my own career, that we don't have any money, or where will this magic money come from? But I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but with the current financial pressures, an alternative structure could offer a more robust, secure funding stream where individual grant ideas could still provide competition through applying to external funding bodies. So this will allow novel impact research to be developed with a layer of security for those whose independent career can progress and flourish, allowing adequate time for this work to be developed without it being squeezed between clinical patients. So the passing on of essential research and academic skills, which is really important, will also occur within these departments and reap that reward of hosting such professionals. So I'm going to ask you, hopefully, if you haven't already, to vote for the motion I've been chosen to propose to effect change, enable substantive contracts, and to financially support clinical academics producing clinically impactful research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian and Matt, and I think you argued that very strongly, and I think it's an important thing to debate, and I applaud the sentiment, but there are too many outstanding issues that haven't been defined and too many potential problems, really. You know, what is it? How would it work? Where would the funding come from? A lot of extra infrastructure, etc. needed. Who is eligible? University roles, too many ifs and buts. So if you think that central funding cannot be used to fund all clinical academics in the NHS, then please vote against this motion.
Very persuasive, Dan. Thank you. I will be brief because I think we're running out of time. I think that the centralised funding for salary provision removes the biggest barrier for the development of clinical academic careers in the NHS. And I think removing the biggest barrier provides opportunities. And I think that's only a positive thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So today we've heard from our colleagues that centralised and salary costs will ensure equal opportunities for clinical academics across the UK, streamline the application process and provide greater job security. However, this is just not the case. Career uncertainty will remain as a seamless clinical academic pathway for non-medics does not exist. There's going to be less diversity in research and clinical academics, and individual choice will be limited. Researchers will be forced to work in more localised silos, which may not benefit them, and it won't reflect national demands for research. I therefore encourage you to vote against.
Thanks, Sarah. That's brilliant.
Okay, so we have some poll results. So our opening poll: this House believes that centralised government funding should support through salary provision the careers of all clinical academics within the NHS. Our opening poll, we had 84% for and 16% against. For our closing poll for the same question, then there's been a flip. We had 58% for and 42% against.
Thanks,
So,
Neil. And
no worries. Thanks, yeah.
I just think that, definitely, I think Dan and Sarah, that you did a brilliant job of actually convincing quite a lot of people, after listening to your arguments to vote against. And with the time that we've got there, I'm going to pass on to Ben to do some closing words. But I just want to say thank you very much for all panelists about all the hard work you facilitate the debate. And we emphasize the audience as well, because I know that there will be social media attentions on the debate. All the points that all the panelists made doesn't reflect how they feel about the topic. So just be kind and be respectful with all the statements that you heard. And remember that, all of this is actually facilitate good and controversial debate for us to carry on for the conversations. So thank you very much for all the panelists. I'm going to pass on to Ben now.
Thank you, Yat. Yes, I just want to say my own thank you to everyone, to our panelists, to Ian, Matt, Dan and Sarah for presenting, I thought, such very persuasive and thought-provoking arguments. Well done. And well done to you, Yat, for excellent sharing. And also to Neil. Neil, thank you, as always, so well organised. We thank you very much for that. And to you, everybody, for participating and joining in. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. There was lots there to think about. And just to say that the next debate will be on Friday, the 18th of November. And again, it'll be exploring another contemporary issue in clinical academia. So I do hope you'll be able to join us for that. So all that's left for me to say is have a good afternoon and enjoy the sunshine. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.